All right, Andrew Oxley, welcome to the Personal Success Podcast. Thanks for spending some time with us.
I'm excited to be here with you, Ryan.
Yeah, so just to get us started, who is Andrew Oxley and what does he care about?
Well, I care about leaders. The purpose of everything we do is to help people engage passionately in their lives. We don't hear a lot about passion in business. We hear about passion in our personal lives, but I believe passion is the underutilized asset, not just for entrepreneurs, but leaders in general. It's hard to get anyone excited about something you're not excited about. And so, what we're trying to do with leaders is help them reconnect to the passion that got them started in their career so that they can actually uh, help other people live a life of purpose and passion as well.
Yeah, that's in my sort of corporate career, and it's funny because I would see people come in with this sort of ultra passion and work their way up several sort of notches, and then they sort of got stuck.
Yeah.
And I did. It was disheartening to see that passion sort of disappear like that. And so I just wonder, if just what led you to this? What led you to sort of see this pattern, perhaps, or however you might characterize it, and decide that there's something had to be done.
Well, it was. There's a couple things that happened. First of all, I had at the age of 28 what I affectionately refer to as my midlife crisis, which was, I'm hoping not the actual midpoint of my life, because I'm approaching the end if that's the case. I was highly successful at a very young age due to the fact I was selling commercial air conditioning in Toronto, and Toronto was going through a building boom at the time. So I was in the right place at the right time. I was leading a highly successful team. But I really felt like that, like there had to be more to life than that, and I felt like I didn't like the person I was going to end up being. And I actually thought the problem was my job. One thing I would say to your audience is the problem with shifting jobs, thinking that your life will improve, is that you take the biggest problem with you, and that's yourself. So I started a company to try to help leaders live a life of purpose and passion. The great thing about doing this full time, as you probably know, Ryan, is like I get a lot of time to study what works and what doesn't work. And I was working at Turner Broadcasting some years ago, and there's this manager who came up to me. He was a mid-level manager. He said, "What if I've lost my passion?" And I remember that day I gave him an answer, and even as I gave it to him, I thought that's not a very good answer. But it was an answer. It's not that it wasn't bad. It just wasn't good. And so I went back and, I started asking myself, well, what do you do if you've lost your passion? And so I started studying that, and I realized the reason we lose our passion quite often is because we start settling for what's comfortable. And, when we settle for what's comfortable, we give up on what's possible. We start accepting things. Well, that's just the way it is in our industry. That's just the way things are. So if you want to reconnect with your passion, the first question you have to ask yourself is, what is sapping me of my passion? And for most leaders, it's the drudgery of the day to day. We tend to think that problems sap us of our passion, but it's not problems. It's having the same problem over and over and over again. So, if we can engage in a pattern of positive growth, then we're starting to do new things. So growth is the antidote to being comfortable, and growth is what all passion stems from. If you think about it in your times in your life, when are you the most passionate? It's typically, when you first were in college, when you first had your first job, when you had your first, house, first got married, first kids. You've got two young kids. I know you're thinking, I don't know about passion, but it's exciting. It doesn't feel that exciting when you're in it because you're like, oh, there's so much going on, and but when we reflect on our lives, the times we felt the most alive was when we were growing, when we were doing new things. So you can do that either reactively or you can do it proactively. You can figure out, well, where do I need to grow? Where do I need to try to do new things? And who do I need to help grow who's part of my life? So the passion you get comes from the growth that you inspire, not just in yourself, but in other people.
There's this idea that I kind of got embedded in my mind about what success was, and it sort of looked like it was sort of passionless. It was like you go to work and you sort of play a role. It was kind of like this Mad Men idea, like the TV show, right? It was like a very masculine, non-emotional, and in getting to talk with Yeah, a lot of different leaders and coaches. I'm seeing like a common theme here, and you're not necessarily talking about like emotional intelligence, but passion is sort of emotionally based, right? And so it seems like the what I'm sort of hearing your work unlocks for people is to help them unlock growth, which ultimately leads them back to passion. How do you help them identify where they might not even be aware they want to grow, or they need to grow, or they could grow?
Yeah, and typically we're working with pretty highly successful leaders who, and most leaders have key performance indicators that are tied to the performance of their group, and so we do things a little bit differently than a lot of coaches and a lot of training organizations who focus on leadership development. I'll tell this by way of an anecdote. Years ago, we were working with Progressive Insurance, and we always ask, what business metric do you want to improve? There would be evidence that your leaders had grown and become more effective. And they said, well, we want the work environment to improve. And I said, well, that's the one business metric I will not accept. And they're like, well, but you don't want the work environment to improve? I'm like, I absolutely want it to, but you don't improve the work environment by focusing on the work environment. You improve the work environment by helping people be more successful. And when people feel successful and they feel like they they're more connected and they're able to achieve things, they usually feel better about their work environment if they do it the right way. Now, if you do it the wrong way, you just feel burnt out and
Yeah,
you've got no energy left, right?
yeah.
So what we do is we want to know, what do you want? We want leaders to be more effective, but we want to know, if your leaders were more effective, how would the business be different? So in this particular case, they chose quality as the key metric, and we worked with about 400 leaders there, and we made incredible strides in the quality of the organization. And interestingly enough, as they did that, their work environment got so much better. People were more passionate about their work. They were more excited about coming to work. They weren't dreading coming to work, because there's nothing that saps people of their emotion and their energy more than feeling that they're failing on a daily basis.
Yeah.
So we always we don't focus on the business metric, we just measure it. And we measure it, and then we focus on helping people be more effective in their leadership capacities.
That's interesting because you hear a lot of talk about the culture and things like that. It's something I think a lot of leaders are concerned with. And you said something interesting there that I might ask you just, I don't know, you did a wonderful job sort of explaining it at a top level there, but something happens when you're like, okay, we need to address the work culture. And then
Mhm.
you focus on that. And you sort of suggested a different route, that you focus on just the metric itself will actually improve that. But what's happening there? What do you see there?
Yeah, we actually have a process we lead our clients through, where we start with the business problem, first of all, not the leadership behavior, not the work environment. What's the business problem that's causing challenges? So whether that be quality, productivity, customer satisfaction, whatever the metric is. And then we ask, okay, so how are we as an organization contributing to that problem? Because what we have a tendency is to focus externally on the causes of those challenges. So in this particular case, what we determined was that the reason we were having trouble with quality was because of the actions of the reps at the front line were not visiting enough of the cars and actually making enough inspections right at the car. So then we asked, well, why is that not happening? And we said, well, because they're not being held accountable by their supervisors to do that. Say, well, okay. So the simple solution then is, well, we need to hold people accountable. Well, accountability is a difficult concept, because you really can't hold anybody accountable to doing anything. I mean, especially in post-COVID, people just say, well, I'm
Yeah.
just going to go somewhere else, right? But
Yeah.
you can create a culture of accountability. We recommend our clients that they create a very specific type of accountability, which we call supportive accountability, where, um, I might ask you, have you always worked for yourself, Ryan, or
No. No, I did not.
you were corporate, right?
Yeah, I was corporate and kind of now I do, and yeah, but I
Okay.
was corporate.
So the best boss you ever had, were they tough on you?
Well, that's a lot of questions. I would say that they were very much. I sort of get what you're getting at. The best boss that I ever had was sort of like, if there was an issue with something I was doing, they would just kind of ask questions.
Yeah.
Why'd you decide to do that? And it was like all of a sudden you'd be like, oh, I see what's happening here.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that answers your question or
Yeah,
not.
yeah. Well, it's always somebody who, they didn't just let things slide. They believed in you, they supported you, they challenged you, they pushed you. That's the best boss. And so that's the kind of boss we want to be to people, right? Letting people get away with stuff they shouldn't be getting away with is not that's not going to create a high achievement environment. So what we taught, we do this through a program we have called Leadership. It's our flagship leadership development program, where we teach leaders how to be create a culture of accountability in a way that people feel responsible for the results that they have committed to, because
Yeah.
they set their goals, they set the objectives for themselves. Now, will that work with everyone? No, it will not work with everyone. But we underestimate the number of people who want to be successful. They've just given up because they feel like their leadership is, they are setting goals that are just not achievable for them. So when you're doing this with an employee, when you're doing this with people, if you imagine the comfort zone being like this sphere that sort of surrounds somebody, right? The problem we run into is we set goals for them that are so far outside their comfort zone that they don't believe it's possible. And because they don't believe it's possible, they don't engage wholeheartedly in the actions that will create the results that you know are possible as a leader. They go through it half-heartedly. And so what we need to as leaders is we need to sort of talk about the ultimate what we're trying to achieve, but set goals that are believable for them incrementally so that they make progress in the direction of the overall objective. So the way to get someone outside a comfort zone isn't to challenge them to do something they don't think they can do. It's to tell them you believe they're capable of doing that, but all you want them to commit to right now is this marginal change, this small change that will encourage them in a pattern of positive growth. There's an old
Yeah.
saying that a body in motion tends to stay in motion and a body at rest tends to stay at rest. So we got to get them in motion. Once you get them in motion, it's much easier to keep them in motion.
Now, I want to talk about the leader as sort of an archetype for a moment here. There's a gentleman who is a CEO that I spoke with on this podcast, and I remember he said something. He goes, "I said, what is advice you would give to leaders?" And he said, "Stay above the fray." And I was like, "Well, that is great advice," because I think what happens is that, well, I might ask you in your experience when you talk with leaders, what is it that doesn't enable them to kind of, what is it that is the obstacle towards sort of achieving? Is there a common obstacle that you see, or I'm just kind of curious about that.
Yeah, well, I love that concept of staying above the fray, right? Because nothing positive comes from negative thought. And so, when two people come together and one's negative and one's positive, they're not going to stay together for very long unless one influences the other. Now, it's always easier to make somebody more negative, much more difficult to make them more positive, right? As a leader, the challenge that I see especially for frontline leaders or, especially in geographically diverse organizations, is that they're leading people who are telling them every day that things are not possible, that they can't do things. And after a while, it gets into your mind. You start to actually see things from the perspective of your employee, but more importantly, you start believing that their point of view is accurate. Right. So I need to be able to empathetically attach to or understand the point of view of my employee, but I don't need to buy into their limiting beliefs about what's possible and what's not possible. So one of the biggest challenges I see why leaders can't stay above the fray is because they get a steady diet of negativity from the people they're seeking to lead and seeking to shift. And the hardest thing in the world to do is to maintain a belief that it's possible while intellectually understanding that it's not happening right now. Now, James Stockdale was interviewed by Jim Collins in his book, Good to Great. And in that book, he talked about the Stockdale Paradox, right? That you have to maintain faith in the future while staying connected to the present. And in working with leaders, what I find is that if you put the present in one hand and belief in the future in the other, every leader has a natural tendency to one or the other. They're either all about it's going to be great when, or they are sort of mired in the moment. Both are incredibly dangerous because if I get mired in the moment, I can't lead because nobody believes it's going to get better. And if I just talk about how great it's going to be, but I ignore the present, then I lose credibility with my team. So for leaders, you have to know which one of these you have a tendency to get mired in, the future or the present. Once I know which one I tend towards, and by the way, if you don't know, ask your team, they know.
Yeah.
Ask someone who knows you well, perhaps they know. Once I know which one I tend towards, then I need to develop the skill. For example, if I'm a little bit of a pessimist and I'm starting to get sucked into the present, I need to develop a passion for the future that I find exciting, which goes right back to the conversation we started with, right? That what would be passionate? Well, I tell you what wouldn't be passionate. What wouldn't be passionate is incremental progress. Never passionate about that. Big goals. I think, forget who said that small goals have no power to inspire the minds of men and the hearts of men, right? You got to go after something that matters. So you might ask your podcast audience, think about what's wrong with our industry? What's wrong that if it was fixed, I don't know how to do it, but it would be so cool if we could figure out a way to fix this. That would be good for the employees. It would be good for our customers. That's a goal worth going after. And I bet you your employees would want to go after that goal as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's, it's funny because I'm thinking back to the same CEO again, and he said that, the question I asked him was something like, what keeps you up at night? And he's like, well, I want to make sure that the mission that I'm asking my people to go after is worth their time.
Yeah.
And I just, that for me kind of blew my mind, but I hear that in what you're saying here, just kind of slightly different. Do they know, first of all, what the next step is, right? Do they believe it could happen? And I remember kind of a transformative point for me, because I always I definitely was always in the future, so I would times in my leadership development, I'd be like, wait, how come you guys we're going this way. Let's go. What are you doing back there? And frustration came from that. And so I remember I would be like, what is the problem? And I just started asking them, I was like, do you believe that we can get here? And then that's where I could see, they didn't answer me. They just kind of like, it's a little out there. And I was like, oh, that's what it is. Why? And then it was, well, what's in the way of that? And then all of a sudden, all the obstacles would come out.
Yes.
And so I got to see that. And once it was like, oh, okay. Well, here, and I already knew my way around these obstacles. So it was just kind of not telling them, but helping them just define their own way through it. Right.
Yes.
And I saw
Yeah.
passion come from that.
Yeah. Because, when you're going after something that really matters, people will inevitably say, well, we don't know how to do that. And, I always freak leaders out when they say that, because I always say, well, isn't that great? And they're like, what? No, it's not great. We don't know how. I'm like, well, see, you're not supposed to know how to achieve a goal. If you know how to get to the goal, it's not even a good goal. One of my first mentors said to me, the purpose of a goal is not to achieve the goal. The purpose of a goal is to learn what you need to learn so you can achieve the goal, because knowledge can't be taken away from you. Like if somebody took away everything you had right now, it wouldn't take you that long to get it back, because you know how to do it now, right? But the learning process is hard. Now, as leaders, one of the challenges we face is that problems always look easy in the rearview mirror. Like once you've solved this, like, why did that take so long? And then we go try to teach someone else when we forget that wasn't easy for us to learn. So we have to have a lot of patience. Now, the frustration, if I'm not careful, I don't experience passion as a leader. I experience frustration that there's a gap between where we are and where I'd like to be. Well, the truth is there'll always be a gap, because as soon as you get to where you think you're trying to get to now, you're going to set another goal. Now, this is why it's important to have a big purpose, a big mission, a big thing you're trying to accomplish, because if you're not careful, what happens is that you accomplish a goal and your people are like, we did it. And you're like, yeah, here's our new goal. And they're like, wait a minute, I thought that was what we got a new goal now? And they're like, you're like, yeah. And they're like, well, so when are we done? Well, we're never done. Isn't that fantastic? And they're like, no, that's not fantastic. No matter how hard I work, no matter what I do, you're never going to be happy. So I'll just sort of do the best I can. And all the marginal effort goes away. So as leaders, we have to make sure we should have goals for sure, but goals are just mileposts on the way to some ideal. And it's the ideal that people are passionate about, not the goal. The goal is sort of just let you know you're headed in the right direction. Ideals are sort of like the horizon. You never get there, because if you get close, you set a new ideal, but it's okay because people understand, well, this is an idealistic future we're trying to create. And this goal is just a way to get towards that ideal.
Andrew, I feel like you did like a reference check on me, because I think in my leadership career, I did that a lot. I was like, great job, everyone. And now let's talk about the next step. And then I would literally feel the air sort of, be sucked out of the room when I said that. It was almost devaluing their experience. It was like, oh, hey, we're having a celebration, but hey, this is just sort of you know, a milestone. And then now we're moving on very quickly here. And I did one of two things. I either sort of decided I needed to have a gap of time before I started talking about it, but sort of quietly we're pushing them that in that direction. Or I just said, hey, they're just gonna have to understand the world we live in. And I don't think either one of those were correct. So that seems like an interesting spot that I think leaders might get some sort of success. Like, and then all of a sudden it falls off because they run into just that paradox there, that kind of how do we keep the team moving forward?
Exactly.
What can you tell leaders about how to navigate that particular intersection?
Yeah, well, as with most things, I now understand it's because I made the mistake myself, and so I merged two companies together years ago, and one of the partners I brought in the business, we were going after a big chunk of business with Coca-Cola, and we got a call from the head of training there, and she said, "You guys, you were successful, that you're accepting your RFP," and I was like, and my partner was sitting with me in the office, um, and I'm on the phone, and I said, I finished the conversation with the client, hung up the phone, and I looked at my partner and said, "Okay, let's talk about Turner Broadcasting." And she was like, "Oh my gosh, I thought I was bad." Like, literally, no, that's awesome. Let's celebrate for a second. You're just on to the next thing. And I was like, and at the time I was like, "Well, is that bad?" And she's like, "Yes, that's horrible. Like, you need to." But I thought she was just like, at the time she was really saying, "Well, you should celebrate a little bit." And while that is true, and I think we should celebrate, we talk way too much about what's wrong and not what's going well, but we need to have goals connected to an overall ideal or purpose in the business. And a lot of times when you're working with mid-level leaders, they're like, "Well, I don't set the purpose. That's set by the CEO or but that's not true. The corporate purpose is set by them, but you can set the purpose for your group." So I'll give you an example of the way to do this. We were working with Mohawk Industries some years back, and they had a pretty large customer service group. It was about 400 employees. The director of that group was an incredibly great, talented leader. His name was Tim Gray. I'll give him kudos. Tim basically identified that he had high turnover, low motivation. All his good employees got poached by other parts of the company because customer service was an entry point to go work in other more desirable departments. So I said, we were talking about this. And I said, "Well, what are you trying to achieve?" He said, "Well," he gave me the purpose and the mission of Mohawk. I said, "Does that resonate with your team?" So first of all, ask, if you're a leader, ask, "Does the purpose of my organization resonate with my team?" Because it probably doesn't. They're probably like theirs was to create world-class customer service or something like that. And they're like, "Yeah, blah, 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 blah." Did they want to do that? Sure. But did that really benefit them? We could have tried to figure out how it did, but really they didn't connect with that. I said, what do you want?" He said, "I want my people to be successful. I want them to continue to work here in customer service. I want to create a career path for them. I want them to feel like they're doing something meaningful." So we changed the purpose of that group to create an organization that provides career growth so that people can progress to what they truly desire to do.
Oh
Now,
wow.
we didn't. So that became the purpose. Now the question is, how do we do all that? Right. So now you got to figure out, how do we create that career growth? He was a little worried that he'd still lose everybody, but what ended up happening was he still lost people for sure, right? Because he was growing people. Some went to other groups and some stayed because that was the right place for them. Some of them came back because they're like, "It really isn't that great over there. I'd much rather work here because you are investing in us and you're helping us grow as individuals." Time, their turnover rate decreased precipitously. Their engagement levels came up and their work environment surveys went through the roof because they invested in their people and helped them be successful. So,
Yeah.
the ideal doesn't have to be something like flowery. It was just like, what would cause people to want to stay? Well, if they felt like they were growing and they had a career path here within customer service.
Yeah.
So that's what we created.
Yeah, I think in another way of speaking, it's like you just kind of helped them understand how the work was meaningful, right? And what value it was sort of creating as a group there. Because I think there's a natural desire for community, whether it be, part of a work culture or just, a general being, connected as a human being to a group. And I think there's something there that was unlocked when you just sort of changed the wording that allowed them to grasp onto more meaning. It seems to have been very powerful there.
Yeah, because it has to be about them, right? It can't be about, if they can't connect to it. And so sometimes leaders will say, "Well, what if I set a purpose that doesn't, my manager doesn't like?" I said, "Well, that's rarely ever going to happen. If it's helping your team be more connected, successful, I mean, I guess you could, but I've never seen it happen actually.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's the question of, when you're thinking about mid-level, do they feel empowered to do that? Right. There's that kind of tiptoe feeling, which I
Yeah.
always, I never found a great way to sort of deal with that. It's like, hey, maybe there's a couple of times where I said, listen, it's always better to ask for forgiveness than permission.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sometimes that was the truth.
Yeah.
So, Andrew, I just want to talk to you about and about what this work is obviously meaningful to you and
Mhm.
important to you, and I guess in your own words, what makes it important and meaningful to Andrew Oxley?
Well, one of the things that I love is when I meet a spouse of a client that I'm coaching and they're like, I really like my husband better. Because what that tells me is that not that there was something wrong with them before, but they're growing as an individual, right? So when I see people being more successful both at home and work, that to me is the reason I started this company because it wasn't to grow a big coaching practice. I mean, we've been very successful in the companies we've worked with and stuff, but it's really to impact lives and help people change. I think and one of the reasons why we moved a little bit away from big corporate clients is not all corporate clients, but a lot of them just sort of suck the soul out of people. And so, if you've got corporate clients on the call, I would just guard against that. Your identity can't be solely defined by what you do, because at some point you will not be doing what you currently do. You should define your identity by your values and what's really important to you.
Yeah, it's interesting there just to put a fine point on that. That the first thing you brought up was something that it's almost not even. I mean, you're sort of an executive coach. You
Mhm.
were talking about the rewarding thing for you is talking to their spouse and about how what they've sort of discovered about themselves has spread into their personal lives as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Somebody said to me years ago, you're becoming the person you're going to be in retirement. And a lot of people just sort of wait for retirement and they're like, okay, so what do I do now? But their identity is completely wrapped up in what they did. So they've lost themselves when they retire. They don't know who they are. Maybe they spend all their days golfing. And if that's what they want to do, that's fantastic. But like, what is it that's going to make you happy in retirement? So you're becoming that person. I want people to live life now, not live for some point in the future when things are going to be so much better, right? And a lot of people individually I coach, they love what they do. They love their work. And I'm like, that's awesome. You're successful because you love your work, I'm sure.
Yeah.
But what else do you love doing? Don't allow your identity to be defined by just what you do, because the values you have that are important to you have to connect with those. And values are like an ideal or aspirational. And everybody says, well, family is a core value for me. And years ago, I had somebody challenge me on that. He said, well, don't you think everyone says that? Even husbands that cheat on their wives said the family is a core value. And then they go do stuff that's completely in contrast to that. And I was like, okay. He said, so what does that make? What does it mean to you? And I thought about it a long time. And I came up with this little thing. And boy, I do not always live up to this standard, Brian, but I would just say this is what I thought that family meant to me. I wanted to be the kind of man that my daughters would aspire to marry. And I wanted to be the kind of man, and I wanted to treat my wife the way I would want my sons to treat their future wives. Now, that's hard. That's
Yeah.
a much harder standard than just, I want to be a good dad. Because sometimes when you're arguing with your spouse and you feel like you're completely justified, and I'm like, how would I want my son-in-law to act in this situation?
Yeah.
I'm like, huh, okay, that's a no, no, I don't want to do that, you know?
That's different than what I was gonna do. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
when you think about your values, don't just think about what they are. What would that look like? If you were really living that value, what would that look like? And let that be your identity, not the boat, the car, the house, the job, because all that stuff is gone at some point. But the relationships you have, who you become, is yours forever.
I love that person pushed back on that and said, "Yeah, what everybody says, family. What does that really mean to you?" And I think there is something there because I talk to a lot of people about values, and I think a lot of us we just don't know what we value. We write down initially what sounds good, but then you start thinking about it and you're like, wait, everybody might say this. What does this actually mean to me? And so my question for you, Andrew, is that, I'm assuming there's something like this that you do in your coaching program. How do you sort of check them on their values? Is it with that question or another method?
Yeah, well, we have an exercise we call values in action. So let's say, for example, because you can do this corporately, you can do this personally, of course, too. But I was being challenged personally, but since I own my own business, it's actually, my values are my
Yeah,
business values as well.
sure.
So whatever the value is. So for example, let's say one of the values is, I was just working with a company and one of their values was, go the extra mile. Okay. So that's awesome. And so what we do, we say, okay, so we should go the extra mile. What does that mean? What does that mean to the tech on the front line? What are some behaviors that would evidence that they were living that value? What are some things that you don't want to see? What are some and they do the same thing for every position in the organization. What does that look like in action? Now, when you ask leaders this, they're like, "Oh, well, I don't know. I just know it when I see it." See, that's a cop out. It is hard to identify. But even if you know it when you see it, do you point it out? Like if I see you doing something and you work in my organization and I say, Ryan, I'm so excited. What I just saw you do, you are living one of our core values. You're living this core value. And I'm so excited to see you doing that, right? And then I tell the story maybe at a group meeting. Now, I don't say, I wish you guys would be just like Ryan, because that's not a compliment to Ryan.
I have to tell you that there's something that's just really clicking with me about the discussion about values here is values in action. What does it look like? And I think, for me in my own sort of development, this was a tough one for me because I would go through value exercises and I'd sort of end up at different places, and I think really in my own experience, what I came to was, how is this showing up in my real life right now today? What does it look like? If I value this, what am I doing to kind of express that value? And that seems really close to sort of what you're saying here.
Yeah, for sure. And so you just, it's hard work though. Sometimes
It's
if I'm coaching a leader and they're looking for the sort of like the microwave solution to leadership,
Yeah.
and you don't microwave leadership. It's a slow cook. So one of the things that we want to do when we're looking at values in action is just keep a little pad of paper, or you can do it on your phone and say, like, this particular position, sometimes it's easier to see when people are transgressing the value. And you can point that out, but try to figure out, well, what would the opposite of that be? What would I have liked them to have done? And coach on that. I think we need fewer rules in organizations and we need more connection of behavior to values because people can't remember a bunch of rules and they seem arbitrary. Like your kids are too. And, when they ask, well, Dad, why can't I do this? You're like, well, because I said so, which, works for a very small amount of time with children.
right.
And then they start
If at
saying, well,
all.
why? Because I said so is not a great response for adults, right? So, sometimes it has to be the response because you can't share information because it's not time. But it can't be your normal response. So there has to be a reason. So if I'm working with a client and they've got staff that's on their phones and they're not paying attention to customers when they're walking in. I'm like, okay, so what core value does that violate? And they're like, well, it violates we treat everyone like they're a member of the family that we like. Well, okay, so talk about that. Say the reason we don't want you to be on the phone is one of our core values is this. So if you tie your feedback back to core values, you're actually doing the values in action conversation with people live. And people start to say, oh, so the reason we shouldn't be on our phone is because, it doesn't create a customer service, environment for people.
Yeah.
People feel like they're interrupting us.
Yeah.
And if
Absolutely.
they
That
don't
makes a lot of
understand that,
sense.
then you may have to explain that to them. And one of the things that we do sometimes is we'll take the company out of the mix. We did this one time with a company and we actually gave everybody $20 and told them to go buy lunch somewhere. They could not go to the same place, but they just had to observe the behavior of the staff and come back and talk about what they liked and what they didn't like. And so they got this list of what they liked and what they didn't like. And we're like, so how often do you think our customers experience similar behaviors from us, either they don't like or but like? And the defensiveness comes down when you're not talking about your own organization, when you're looking at somebody else's, right? And they're
Yeah.
like, oh my gosh, we probably do the same thing to people sometimes.
Yeah.
So that's just a way to sort of, you got to get people out of the way they see the world and start trying to figure out how do we get them to see the world differently.
Yeah, and I think that comes down to, I guess I might ask you how you might define leadership, because I think I sort of kind of calling back to what I said about this idea of, do it because I said so. I'm the boss. Kind of. I always saw leadership, and I use this example all the time, was the general on the hill saying, charge. But I've come to find that leadership is sort of what happens leading everything that happens before you get to that point, right? That's kind of the way I've explained it, or I've discovered in my own experience. How would you sort of define leadership in the way that you're coaching executives and CEOs and leaders in different companies?
Yeah, there's two things I would say about that. I love what John Maxwell says about leadership. He says that leadership is influence. And if you don't have influence, you're not a leader. So people sometimes say to me, how do I know how much influence I have? And so I came across this litmus test years ago. And it basically is how many people ask you for advice that don't have to? So your employees don't count. How many people come to you and ask you for your insight, your advice, your thoughts? They don't have to, they just value it. That's influence, right? Authority is not influence.
Right.
Now, we actually look at leadership and we say leadership always involves a journey. In fact, if a journey is not involved, a leader is not required. So a leader is taking people or organizations from somewhere to somewhere. There's a journey. And to go on a journey, you have to know three things. You got to know where you are, you got to know where you're going, and you got to know the path. And as leaders, so often we just start with the path. Here's how we're going to get to where we're going. And there's a presumption there that everyone agrees and wants to get to the destination, which is what we were talking about earlier with the ideal, right? But the other end of it is, where are we starting from? And I found that is the stickiest point of all, because most people don't agree. Even like take the most measurable occupation on the face of the earth, sales, right? It would be hard for a salesperson to disagree what their sales numbers are. But you know what they do disagree on? Why? Well, it's not my fault. It's not me. It's the product, it's the customer, it's the customer service group, it's our delivery system, it's the marketplace. Well, if I have a prepackaged solution as a leader that I'm giving someone and they don't agree what the problem is, my solution is irrelevant. Even if it's right, they won't buy in. And so we always say as a leader, you got to get really good. And this is what your boss was doing with you, right? When he was asking you questions, he was getting you to understand what the problem was. He wasn't telling you what the problem was. It's like when you tell someone what the problem is, they just go, yeah, 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 you don't understand. And they arrive at that conclusion themselves. They're like, oh, I see the problem. Now they don't know the solution, but they understand the problem. And they're like, okay, so what do I do about that? Now, either they know or they don't know. If they don't know, then you can help them with the solution. But you have to connect them to clearly identify what the real problem is. And you do this best by asking questions, not by telling them what the problem is.
Yeah, the power of guiding instead
Yes.
of telling. There's something that's been profound in my life with that. I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about the different frameworks that I've been able to sort of begin to understand. And I wonder what you could tell me about the core principles behind the 7 levels of CEO freedom.
Right. Yeah. So a lot of the entrepreneurs we work for with organizations, they had um, their company in what Michael Gerber called an entrepreneurial fit. Where they had this idea that I understand whatever plumbing, electrical work, construction, whatever it is, and so therefore I would be a really great business owner. And they're two very different skills, right? So we start as you start the company as a startup phase. You may have a couple of people, and then you start to multiply. And at some point, the leader can't touch everything anymore. Right. And so they actually start to put leaders in charge of different things. And all of a sudden they have to touch people through those individuals. And the complexity of the organization goes up at that point. So within each one of these stages, you actually have transition points. And it's actually incredibly difficult to transition from one phase to another, which causes leaders to sometimes feel like I should just return to a time when the business was simpler, because I was having a whole lot more fun then. The problem with that is it's hard to get back to that point of equilibrium, because market forces tend to sort of cause you to need to grow just to stay even with the market, right? In addition to that, the people you want to attract to your business, A players, people who are really good at what they do, they want to be part of a growing company. They don't want to be part of a stagnant company generally. So when you start to shrink the organization, you start to lose your best people. And so, you start to accelerate through what we call team acceleration. That's when the teams actually start to gel together. And ultimately, we get to strategic acceleration, where we actually have a strategy. Because the strategy for most businesses at some point is we just want to survive. Well, that's not a strategy. It's a mandate.
Yeah.
And then ultimately we want to create that level where the CEO has the freedom to associate with the type of people they want to associate with. They have the freedom to spend time on the things they want to spend time on, and they have the freedom to do the things they want to do. That's why people start companies, but that promise is rarely recognized and achieved. So the overall model of the journey helps entrepreneurs understand where they are. Like, I was working with a company last week, and I think they have about 500 employees right now, and they're in the team acceleration phase. They're a big company, but they could have been in the team acceleration phase back when they had 50 employees, but they didn't. They're still sort of working through that particular phase of their growth. So what we try to do is we try to have models that help businesses and leaders understand where they are, and then models within those growth phases that help them get to the next phase.
Yeah, it's funny. It sounds like, of course, when you talk about sales and numbers, that sort of makes things really tangible. But it really sounds like it's much more of an art than anything here, that you've kind of understand, because I can certainly see. I've never been the CEO of a company, but I can certainly see those different growth things in starting my own business, and that tendency to kind of want to go back to it. It was simple and exciting, and we're just trying to survive. But that doesn't inevitably work. The fact that you were able to sort of put language to that just really, I think, probably is a big indicator of sort of the quality that you can bring through your programs to these different companies. Because there hasn't been anything that I've asked you where you're like, oh, that's an easy one. We kind of do this just to kind of, the experience speaks for itself, Andrew. It's very clear here.
Well, when you make lots of mistakes, Ryan, you learn things, right? And I made lots of mistakes. So,
Yeah.
and the other thing is, I've had the luxury of doing this where I get to see what works and what doesn't work, because I work with a lot of different leaders. And so I don't just learn from my errors. I've learned by observing. Sometimes the challenge we get into, is that when we run up against a problem, something we don't understand, we get busy with what we do know, right? So I would challenge all your listeners to write down one question that they don't know the answer to right now that would help them be a better leader. What's one question you have? And then go find someone who can help you with that. But what we do is we get busy with everything we know. And because we are operating off our current knowledge levels, right, we keep getting the same problems over and over and over again. The problems are put in your way as sort of like little directional finders for this is what you need to learn. So one problem I hear from leaders a lot is young people today just aren't motivated. I'm like, pretty sure our parents said the same thing about us. Now,
Yeah.
do I think this generation's different? Yeah, I really do. They want to be led differently. They will work harder for a mission than a paycheck. And when I started my career, I just tell me what you need me to do. I'll work hard in anticipation at some point it will all pay off. And young people today have seen too many people where that didn't pay off for them. They're
Yeah.
like, no, I'm not going to wait for something that may or may not ever happen. So if I complain about young people, it's like yelling at the wind. It doesn't change the wind, and I'm exhausted at the end of it. So the question
Yeah.
is not what's wrong with young people. It's like, how do I need to lead this generation differently?
Yeah.
That's what I need to figure out.
Absolutely. Thank you again, Andrew. I really apologize. I appreciate your time, and I hate to hold us up here, but I thought you were talking about something really, really important there. And that is, I heard that, and I still hear it from people that I know that are involved in business, is the new generation they don't want to move up. You can't motivate them with money. You can't, all these different things. And it's funny that you just kind of changed the way I thought about it. We're not asking the right questions. How do we motivate them?
Yeah.
They're still human beings.
Yep.
They have the sort of same components that we do. How do we inspire them? How do we give their work purpose? And I think that's an interesting question. How do you help executives and leaders begin to understand that, aside from asking that question?
Well, there's an old saying that fish discover water last.
Yeah.
They don't even know they're in water, right?
Yeah.
So the first question we ask leaders is, well, what motivates you? And they're like, well, family, I don't know. Well,
Yeah,
if you don't know what motivates you, how are you going to create a motivational environment for other people? Right. So the first thing we have to do is we have to understand that there there's not an infinite number of motivational schemes out there. And if someone's motivated by money, that's so simple. I mean, but that's about 15% of the population.
sure.
So
Yeah,
so
it's less than you'd think.
is money motivational? It is absolutely motivational. But people tell you money doesn't motivate. Well, yes, it does. It absolutely motivates. The question really is it the number one for somebody, right? For most people, if they're earning a respectable amount of money for the job that they're doing, money no longer is the motivator, right? So it's going to be something else. It's going to be, and so we've done a lot of work around this, and we've identified that there are 6 core motivations for most people. And the problem is that when we assess people on this and they read the language associated with it, they're like, oh my gosh, yeah, that's true. That's me. And those ones that I'm really low on, I wouldn't even care about that. So what we have a tendency to do, we don't really understand what motivates us consciously, but subconsciously, it's the language we use, and the language we use either inspires or demotivates people. And quite often, it demotivates the people that we're struggling with. So first of all, we got to understand what we're motivated by, and then if you sat down with those 6 core motivators with your employees and you said the descriptions of them, say, which ones of these resonate with you and which one of them really don't? And what they'll tell you is, well, that one there, that just pisses me off when people talk about that. And so you're like, okay, so let's not talk about that one. You know, so you have to first understand you, and then you can start to understand other people. So and by the way, there's all sorts of work done around values and motivation. We write about it. If people come to our blog and you want to learn more about this, you can just subscribe to our blog, and you'll see all sorts of information on there
Yeah.
that'll help you with this.
And that link will be in the show notes and all that too. So just to talk about Andrew Oxley's beliefs with a lot of this, do you believe that everyone sort of has a true purpose? Is that something you find, or something that's in there, or how do you understand that as an individual or as a leader?
Yeah, I believe everybody does have a purpose. I believe very few people know what it is. And I think people wander through life hoping to make it safely to death. And I think that we were designed for more than that. We were designed for a purpose. And what is that purpose? Well, it's not my job to tell people what it is. It is my job to help them discover that. It's like values. You don't write your values, you discover your values. They're like inside you. And when someone transgresses one of your core values, that's what will tear relationships apart more than anything else. So understanding what your core values are, understanding what your purpose is not easy work. You could write something down, and early in my career, I wrote stuff down, and I look back at it now, I'm like, you know what, that really wasn't very good. But it got me closer to where I am today. So don't try to make it perfect. Just try to make progress. And when you make progress, you're like, okay, so I'm not sure that's perfect. But if you write it down, read it every day for 30 days. And if you do that, well, for a little while, you'll be like, you know what? I probably would say that differently. I don't know if that's really true about me. So revisiting this stuff is key. Now, is knowing your purpose key to being successful in life? Well, it depends how you define success, right? If you define success as accumulating a lot of stuff, then no, it doesn't matter. But if you define success as, well, a lot of people say, oh, I just feel lost. I got midpoint through my life and I feel lost. I mean, like, well, that's because they've allowed their job to become their identity and they're not feeling fulfilled in their job. So they start trying to change things around them. The harder work is trying to figure out, well, what is truly important to me and what am I passionate about? Because your passion should become your purpose, because that's a great indication of what you are truly interested in.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. I love what you said there about just writing it down, and then reviewing it for 30 days, because I do think it's, if you have a quiet moment and, you're writing this stuff down in the morning, at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, on Friday, that might look different. Right. And I'm just sort of pointing to, we're sort of always changing. Right.
Mhm.
But where's the through line? And I think that's sort of what we have trouble putting our finger on exactly, is like what. So it seemed like this was my value was the one that I, excuse me, it showed up in a bunch of different ways, was what I came to know is sort of excellence, right? Just it's really important to me to do a good job in everything I do.
Mhm.
And at first it was like order, because I would think people told me I'm a compulsive folder. And it was because, I just didn't like things like out of order. No, certainly things will become out of order or whatnot, but it took me a while to understand what that was. It was just that was one way it showed up for me to do this sort of do what I do well, right? That
Huh?
was really important to me.
Uh-huh.
And so, times where I was struggling, that that sort of value was being violated by me or sort of somebody else, right? And that was a journey to get there, right?
Uh-huh.
Because if you would have asked me at the beginning, "Oh, excellence is," I would have been like, "No, that's not me." But that's the word I ended up on, and it kind of was doing something like you said, writing down this sort of value statement or this where you're really connecting with that through line I was referring to, and checking it over 30 days. I think 30 days is a great sort of time frame to consider the same point and how it looks at different lights, to say.
Yeah. And so, you just take a value like excellence and say, well, what does that mean in different parts of my life? What does that look like in my relationship with my spouse, with my relationship with my children, relationship with my friends? Years ago, I did this exercise. It was called the Wheel of Life, and basically, you plotted your success on all these different spokes based on your spiritual development, your physical development, your mental development, your
Mhm.
financial development, your career development, your social development. And I just was depressed at the end of it. I'm like, man, I've got so much work to do.
Yeah.
And I think, the question is, what is truly important to me? Is a better question. All those exercises are good, but if they immobilize us because we feel like we don't know what to do next, you can only make progress, in small increments. Even if the goal is large, what do I need to start doing right now? What's the first thing I need to do? If excellence is one of my values, what's an area of my life where I feel like maybe I'm not living up to that standard? And what's one thing that I could do differently? Now, when we work with leaders, we ask them to set goals in a very specific way. We say, at least once a day, I will. At least once a day, I will. Will what? What's the commitment? Not like coach an employee for an hour. No, you're not going to do. What's one thing you could do differently? What's a habit that would move you in the direction of your goals? Because if you think about it, we don't have as many problems as we have habits that we need to work on. There there are certain core habits. So if you're a leader listening to this podcast, or even if you're not, think about somebody and think about, that maybe isn't achieving what they would really like to achieve. What's a habit that they're missing? Because this is easier to identify with other people than ourselves, right? It's much harder
Yeah.
to identify with ourselves.
Yeah, it is.
What's a habit they're missing? I'm like, well, they're always late. They're not grateful. They don't do what they say they're going to do. They're always, in a tizzy when they're confusing. Well, what's one habit that would help them? So if you're coaching them, you should coach them on habits, not tactics and not goals. Coach them on the habit that will help them be successful. And then identify what's one habit you need. Luckily for us, there's not an infinite number of habits that actually generate success in leadership. There's actually a very small sort of grouping of them. So
Yeah.
it's not even that many different things we need to master in order to be successful.
So that was interesting how you kind of wrap that up there. What are some of those? What are some of those habits that you really need to kind of develop in order to be a more effective leader?
So we've identified 5 core habits that are key that manifest in a lot of different actions. So the first one is being strategic, which you could interpret it as being proactive and not being a plaything of the environment you find yourself in, right? So every job requires us to look a little bit further down the road than the front of the car. Because when you're looking too close, you're jerking the car all over the place and you're reacting to everything. So if I'm being very reactive, I got to work on how do I become more proactive appropriately to my position, right? That's the first one. Being more collaborative with people, working on involving people appropriately in decisions that are being made where they have better information. Empowering people properly. I hate it when words enter the political realm because, they change their meaning, but truly empowering people, which means that people are empowered. I get leaders telling me, well, I'm trying to empower my people, but they won't accept it. Well, then you're not really empowering them. So I'm not saying it's their fault, but, we need to figure out, okay, so what do I need to do differently if people aren't accepting the empowerment? Being customer focused, either internally or externally, because ultimately they're the people that we serve within the organization. And lastly, being innovative, that we always have to be trying to figure out, what do I need to change? How do I need to get better? How does our organization need to get better? What skills, behaviors, beliefs, or processes need to shift so we can be more successful as an organization? So those are the 5 core, like, sort of habits we look at for leaders that manifest in many different ways, depending on the position and the company, of course.
I love that framework.
Yeah.
Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask. There was something I saw, the book, The Four Faces of Frustration, that you wrote. It's been 12 years now since the book came out. So
Yes.
it's an old book, but what I loved is the subtitle, which, forgive me, I don't have in front of me. It was how to move from frustration to delight. Was that it? That was lucky. That is the part that was most intriguing to me. How did you come to that? That seems like a journey I've never even heard of before, going from frustration to delight, or turning frustration into delight. It's like, do they have a commonality? There's all kinds of questions. I just wonder about how you came to that conceptualization of it.
Yeah. So a lot of times when I start working with a leader, when our group starts working with leaders, the first question we ask them is, what are your challenges and your frustrations? And as leaders, there's always frustration, right? I'm frustrated with this. I'm frustrated with that. We're frustrated with results. We're frustrated with people, frustrated with our spouse, with our kids, So so we are intimately familiar with our frustration. So is it possible, however, that we are also frustrating others? Not our intention. I mean, at least it shouldn't be to frustrate them, but we do. I mean, if you've ever called into a customer service group and you're so frustrated by the end of it, because
Very
by the
frustrating.
time you get through the voicemail hell and get the AI assistant that can't help you, and you're like, can I just talk to a human, please? And so you get the human's not even very helpful for whatever reason. I guarantee you the CEO of that organization didn't think, how can we design the most frustrating customer service experience for our people? So we frustrate people all the time. We don't even know that we're doing it. So the first thing we need to recognize is, what are my frustrations? But is it possible I'm frustrating other people, even though I'm not trying to do it? So we started looking at this and we started realizing that frustration is universal. Everybody gets frustrated at some point, unless they've just given up, and by the way, life chases you then, and you're still probably frustrated. You just keep lowering your goals. But what frustrates you? How do you recognize frustration in other people? And we came up with a model that actually it's easiest to understand someone's communication style, their behavioral style, when they're frustrated. Because 3 of the 4, I mean, everybody gets angry, right? But 3 of the 4 communication styles transition through anger into frustration, and they start looking differently. So there's one that doesn't. They keep looking angry. They're actually, I would argue, they're just passionate, but it looks angry to other people. Very direct, hard driving individuals. It's never fast enough. It's never good enough. When they give you something, they say they wanted it yesterday. It's just like full throttle constantly. These people love to be in charge. So that's one face of frustration, right? Just passionate about everything they care about. And it's just always never good enough, always charging. The second one is the people who start to they're frustrated, they get angry, but then they feel guilty they got angry, and they start telling you everything's going to be okay, and we're going to be good, and here's what we're going to do. And they use a lot of words, but they say very little. And so we call this the optimist, or the yellow face. The first one was the red face, the yellow face.
Yeah.
Then you have another group of people who actually start getting very quiet, and the emotion for them is non-emotion. There's no emotion associated with them. They just disengage when they're frustrated, and they've tried to tell you what's going on. You're not listening, so they just stop talking. And the fourth one is the one that starts asking tons of questions. So if I could recognize first, like if I could just keep my antennas up when I'm interacting with someone, and maybe it's a stressful situation, a little bit of conflict, and I pay attention to what's going on with them, I can notice whether I'm frustrating them. The problem is, we don't do this. We don't keep our antennas up and out. We go like this, and we start paying attention to how I'm feeling when I'm frustrated.
Yeah.
I don't pay attention to what that person's feeling. But communication is about getting a message across. So I have to understand how my message is landing in order to know if I need to modify. So as
Yeah.
leaders, this helps you with your employees. It helps you with people who work product you need to be able to do your job. It helps you with, in your personal relationships, helps with your customers. Because we all have a tendency to treat people like the way we'd want to be treated, which is awesome in morality and ethics. It's horrible in personal relationships because the
Yes.
presumption is they're just like me. And if it would be okay with me, it must be okay with them. And that's hardly ever true.
Well, that's definitely on my list now. You know, you've been incredibly gracious with your time today.
Well, I mean, we've covered a lot of territory, and so if you were to think about what we do in our practice with leaders, is we try to create very simple models that explain complex things. Because you said earlier that there's an art to this, and the problem with using Chat GPT or something to answer questions about how you should lead your people, it will give you the science, it'll give you the precise answer, right? But what it won't give you is the art. And what you really need to in the art is you need to understand yourself, and you need what we would refer to as a blind spot identifier. You need somebody who will help you understand where you need to change, because we can't see ourselves accurately quite often. We see ourselves in a distorted way. We see ourselves through the lens of who we think we are. Other people probably see us a little bit more clearly. Early on in my career, one of my mentors told me that the amount of progress you make in your life will be directly proportional to the amount of honesty you can accept about yourself. And he followed that up with, he didn't think I was really into honesty. And he was not the kinder,
Ouch.
gentler mentor. And I said to him, wow. And he's like, see what I mean? You see what you just did there? And I was like, oh, yeah, I did. I became defensive. And so I said, well, please tell me more, which is what you're supposed to say. And he did. He told me more. And I thought about that a lot. Like, where do I not see myself clearly? How do I get better? I mean, I know so much more about leadership today than I knew when I started, but I thought I knew more then than I think I know now. Because the more you learn about a subject, the more you realize there is to learn. Right. The Four Faces of Frustration is available on the website, which would be Amazon in this case. And if they want to know more about and more free material, because we do a 90-minute leadership workshop for free, they can go to transformingresults.com and register for the live workshop. There's no commitment required for that. We want people to live a life of purpose and passion. That's one of the things we're working on in the workshop. And then it also educates people. And if they want to know more about us at that point, then they just raise their hand and say, I'd like to know more. We consider our best marketing to be the good work that we do.
Yeah. Well, this has been, I mean, just there's sort of a calm wisdom that you have, right? That has just I think it's really came through. And just the models that you've shared with us here have been really resonant with me. And some of them, I've heard versions of them before, and some of them are really kind of new to the way I'm thinking of. So I want to thank you personally for that, Andrew. And again, I thank you for your time today. And again, what was where on the web, if somebody's just listening, can they connect with you?
Yeah, so our main website is transformingresults.com. Transformingresults.com. I'm also on LinkedIn, Andrew Oxley. We put a lot of stuff out on LinkedIn, so they can connect with us there. If that's easier to remember, Andrew Oxley. And so we put a lot of content out because what I find is when people read the content and help, they're further along in their journey when they sort of engage with us. So we put a lot of free stuff out there for people.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you again for your time. This has been a great conversation. I can't wait for people to hear it.
Well, thanks very much, Ryan, and thank you for your time as well.